Hello, I'm Dr. Greer, and I'm back again this week to talk to you about the changing American society. We're going to continue on that theme, moving into families and households and how this all applies to consumer behavior. I hope you've been having a good time. I hope you've been learning a lot. We're still going to be in external influences this week, so we're getting there. We're getting kind of close. We're about to pivot over to internal influences. This part's always fun because I find that students can readily absorb and use this information on external influences. What I've seen in classes up to this point is that when we start getting into the internal influences is where people start saying, no, that can't be true of me. And so that's always the fun part. So this is getting us to that point, but we're still in external influences in our framework that we're using here. We're just going to go over the basic types of households, what the household life cycle is. That's a big part of what this chapter has, and then the roles that are there, and then finally we're going to talk about socialization, social socialization, and marketing children just briefly at the very end. So let's just jump right into it and get started because there's a lot to talk about. First off, when we look at the nature of American households, remember we went from a very macro level, we're coming down, we're in the United States of America, so we're only going to be dealing with the US market at this point. We can see that there's a couple different pieces of information, or three I would say, that this book proposes that help us make consumer decisions. So it could be the structure of the household unit, with the stage of the household life cycle, and the household decision process. And we'll talk about all three of these because as those three things are identified, that makes up how a household would typically purchase something, which can lead us to saying, okay, if we can figure out what those three components are, we can develop a marketing strategy based around that. And that can be a very powerful marketing strategy depending on who's involved and what's happening in each one of those little groups there. So we have different types of households. Let's talk about this. First off, a household consists of people who occupy a housing unit. So this could be an apartment, a group of rooms, a house, a single room designed to be occupied as separate living quarters. I would say in my household, I have my wife, myself, and my two youngest children. And my son, who's going to college right now, probably like you, lives by himself. Well, he lives in a rented apartment, but he lives all by himself in his own room. And I would say he's probably a household of one. We're a household of four currently. Then we have the family household, which is one having at least two members related by birth, marriage, or adoption, one of whom is the householder, and that's who owns or rents the residence. Okay, so I have a family household. And then a non-family household is a householder living alone or exclusively with others to whom he or she is not related. So my son would be in a non-family household, right? Because he's living with people that are not related to him. When we look at this, we can see that this is once again done in 2011, this study was, but this is the type of household and the percentage of the population that have it. Now this is very fascinating because what we can do is we can start seeing large groups of people, and I always like to, as a marketer, to say, okay, are there enough people and is there enough money in the market to make this idea work? So let's just say, for instance, you have an app idea and you're like, oh, everybody in the world could use this app. That's not a very good way to start as a marketer. What we'd probably want to do is start saying which type of household could use this app. And that will give us a group that we can really start targeting with some good messaging. So yeah, there's the most is married couples. Now, no children at home under 18 is larger than children at home under 18. And last week we talked about demographics. That might be a baby boomer thing. And then we have, let's see here, the next group I would say is female householder living alone is that 17.6 group. So it's just interesting to see the different types of households. I always love to look at these charts. You got to add another 3 zeros to all that, so it's 117 million households in the United States as of 2011. Getting ready to have our next census count, so we'll learn more about that in the next coming years and see how this has changed over the last decade. So the traditional family refers to a married opposite-sex couple and their own or adopted children living at home. And a step family is a married couple a family household with at least one child under the age of 18 who is a stepchild, aka a daughter or son through marriage. Now, I would say that I think that what's happening in America right now culturally is that traditional family is altering over the last decade, and it's becoming a lot more accepted, and realistically is. In a lot of states now, traditional family doesn't have to have opposite sex couples. They could be married of the same sex. And that's just part of what's happened over the last decade in American culture. And so it's just good to understand that. And we can see, I think it's really cool that we get to step back and look at a book that's 10 years old. This is one of the things I love about this book, is we can see the changes in American culture in the last decade. So that's just 10 years, and we can see some of these cool things. Also, we have multi-generational families, which is a household containing at least 2 adult generations or a grandparent, at least one of their generation. So it could be that, someone's being raised by their grandparents, or that the grandparents are there living with the family, or a grandparent. That's just a multi-generational family. So traditionally, the view of the family life cycle is that people get married in their early 20s. And the couple moves on, they have some children, their children grow up and start their own families, and then the original couple retires and become grandma and grandpa, and then the male would eventually die, and a few years later the female would die, and that cycle just goes around and around and around. So this household life cycle, this is kind of the traditional view of what's happened, and for the most part, I would say, without making a broad stereotype, this is what happens to a lot of people. Now, I'd say maybe not in their early 20s anymore for marriage. Maybe people are getting married later. But the couple will have children. Their children will grow up and start their own families. The original couple retires. Like, all that happens. So American households follow much more complex and varied cycles today. And that's why we have developed, or there was researchers that developed something called the HLC, the Household Life Cycle. And it's a great tool, I would say, to help you identify a good marketing strategy for a certain group of people. So each HLC stage presents unique needs and wants, as well as financial conditions and experiences. And we've talked about this a little bit, but it's great when they put it into this graph. And I think this is one of those pages that I would mark down, photocopy. I actually keep this at my desk, a printout of this at work, because when we start talking about stuff, I always like to look at it and just say, okay, which group am I going at? And here at doTERRA, my group is typically one of the same ones, and we can get into that at another time. But it doesn't mean it always is. And so when you look at this, the little X's mean, this is where people could potentially be. So, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because the next couple of pages, or the next couple of slides do, and we won't belabor this point. But if you're below 35, you're in the younger stage of life. And so what we have is single one, meaning that you're single and you have no children at home. That's those 2 X's right there. So you can see right there, 2 X's. If you're young and married, you're married and you have no children. If you're a full nest one, that means you're married and you have children under the age of 6 at your home or in your home. And if you're a single parent, it means you're single and you have children under the age of 6 at home. Now, just really quickly, before we go into middle-aged, if we were to think about that, we would say, okay, what is a product that we're probably going to want to advertise to the full nest and single parent? And an easy one, I'm going to make it easy on everybody, is diapers. Okay, diapers, this is probably the group that we're going to go after with diapers. We have one more down in middle age, which is the delayed full nest one, but we'll talk about them in a second. And so we could just know right by then that we're not looking for single people that are partying and don't have children. We can kind of forget about them and not worry about them when we're doing our marketing campaigns. So these are little life cycle phases that I would say that help us keep our message tuned to the right group of people that we're going to be talking to. We can move on to middle-aged. So this is 35 to 64. I'm betting most of you in the class are below 35. I am in this middle-aged group. So single 2 is single and with no children. Delayed full nest 1 is married, but they have children under the age of 6. A full nest 2 is married and children over the age of 6. So I'm in full nest phase right now. And then the single parent 2 is single, but they have kids over the age of 6. And then the empty nest one is married with no children, which is where I can't wait to be. No, I'm just kidding. I love my children. But like my wife and I went to Moab this weekend. It's a good phase of life when you can just take off and you have money to do stuff. It's kind of a blast. So then we get into the older group, which is empty nest 2, which would be married and no children, and then single 3, which is single with no children. So this doesn't mean that everybody in the world is going to fit in here, but I would say 90% of the people will fit into these groups, and this can be a powerful way for us to separate our marketing. So we just talked about this. We're going to go ahead and skip through it because we just showed you that. But it can help with the segmentation, and it's something that we use to figure out what's going on, and we can predict the purchase and consumption of many of the products that are going to happen in that household life cycle. And so that's just a great part. If you were going to be selling Stouffer's lasagna, the big tray of lasagna, do you think you want to advertise that to a bunch of empty nesters that are older empty nesters, which would be empty nest 2? Or would we want to, send that to, or would we want to advertise that to single 1? Those probably aren't the groups of people. We're probably looking for a good full nest 1 or 2, right? Where there's lots of people in the house, they all need to eat, that kind of stuff. So each stage has its own problems and opportunities, but that's what makes the HLC a great place to start when you're trying to like hone down your marketing materials. And we can make a bunch of assumptions based on income, occupation, education, all these things, because they push a person to kind of think the way that they're going to, or what phase of life they're in helps them make choices. And so I think we've talked about this in the past, but Subaru is always running ads about how safe your children are going to be. Now, is that empty nesters? No, that's at full nest 1 or 2, trying to show you that, hey, our cars are 5-star crash rated on every direction. There was an ad I saw. It was actually a European ad, but it was a fun one that showed Volkswagen. And they were talking about a kid. It shows the kid pulls up, and the dad's sitting in his Passat, and he's all nervous. And the kid gets out, and he's passed his driver's test now. He's failed it 3 times, you can tell. And so the kid comes over, he's like, I passed. He's all excited. And the dad gets out of the car and walks over, and he's like, are you sure that he took the 3-point turn right? He's like, yeah, he did it perfect. He's like, are you sure? Because it's usually a 27-point turn. He's like trying to talk him out of giving his kid a driver's license. And the point said, hey, you want to take care of your car because you love it so much or whatever. But it was definitely aimed at a full nest 2 person who has a kid who is going to start driving their car, and they're terrified as a parent to let that child drive their vehicle. So it was just a good ad, I thought. So we can actually take this and start going through these occupational categories. This is a good little thing to say, okay, based on adding a demographic component in, based on which group they fit into in the HLC, where do I put them, typically in occupation also. And this is a good one. You can go through and use this. It's a fun little tool. So I want to pivot now into family decision making. And so family decision making is the process by which decisions that direct or indirectly involve 2 or more family members are made. Now, I think one of the things that we always like to, one of the things I like to differentiate is the buyer and the user. Okay, and so this gets fun in family decision making because sometimes there are people that you're going to come in contact with that you need to market to the buyer. You need to give them the information. And then sometimes we need to market to the user. And I would say a lot of times people fall into the trap as marketers of marketing to the user. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing that. I don't want you to take that from this. But what we do need to do is make sure that we keep in mind that there is a buyer in a household just like there is in a corporation. So the third paragraph here, most important, many family purchases are inherently emotional and affect the relationships between family members. I always say, this is said all the time, we always make irrational purchases and we look for rational reasons to justify it. So What's the rational reason to justify the irrational purchase? That's what I say all the time around here. And because it's a lot of this is based on emotion. Now, there are family dynamics at work. There are non-family dynamics at work. There's a lot of things that happen. So when we look at that, we want to look as marketers at what are the purchasing rules? How do we determine what they are? What's the conflict resolution that they're using? What's a marketing strategy that we can use to help people make those choices? And then finally, like, how do we make that normalized? What's the socialization of being a consumer and then marketing it to children? Now, before we even get into kids, I always like to say for the decision making, and I know this has been a while, but if you have children, that back when I was a boy, we would watch cartoons on Saturday morning. But let's just say it's YouTube for children, or something that has play school, kid time, kid. That's typically not aimed at a parent. Like it shows some stuff for the parent, but the kid wants to see how enjoyable it is and all this kind of stuff. So kids become influencers or initiators, and then typically the parents are the information gatherers. So, for instance, when my children wanted to get a phone, I had to go out and say, okay, what kind of things am I looking at to get a phone? Now, was Apple targeting them, Samsung targeting them? Was, like who were the companies that were trying to get kids to feel like their phone was right? And then when we look at the communications coming to parents, like, maybe I was getting some stuff like, oh, let your kid be this creative with our phone, or, oh, let your kid's internal happiness shine through with this phone. So we have to get together and make these decisions, and I think you can see sometimes. There's a great comedian. I love Nate Bargatze, if you've ever heard him. He talks about how his daughter takes her to the Walmart and gets her a little snow globe thing, or a little globe spinning toy. And they'd been walking around the Walmart the whole time with it, and so he swapped it out for another one. But his daughter didn't want to get rid of the one she had. He's like, it's exactly the same thing. And they're sitting there having this big struggle in the cart, and it's kind of cute because she's like 2. And he goes, and so I wasn't happy, and she wasn't happy. She didn't play with it anymore. And I think that's just kind of a really good little composite of what can happen in decision making with consumer behavior, which is, sometimes we don't make it easy on ourselves when we purchase something. If you're married, has your spouse ever wanted something that you didn't want, or you guys had a brand of dishwasher, or where you want to go eat that night, and one person finally wins, and I say wins on purpose, wins the argument, and you go, and the other person's just not happy the whole time, and they find every reason to say why that was the wrong purchase or the wrong place to go. That happens a lot in consumer behavior, so we want to make sure that we can prevent that if possible. There's a culture and a subculture that exists in families. One of my students in a previous class had told me about how he had married into a different type of culture where the man was supposed to have much more of a voice in the home, and he had married a pretty independent female, and there was conflict with the family dynamic whenever they were in their external family culture, I would say, subculture. And so those things can happen. There can also be role specialization for different family members. Does my wife hates to shop? I love to shop, so I actually investigate all that kind of stuff. That drives her crazy, so she doesn't want to do it. And then what's the degree of involvement? If there's an electronics being purchased in my home, my wife's not buying it. That's not her thing. She doesn't get into it. I like the cable. I like the TV. I want to know everything about all of it. So I'm pretty into that kind of stuff. And then also, like, just what are the characteristics of each individual in the house? So these are all things that can affect the different dynamics. There was, in this little study that they had done in the textbook here, it talks about decision-making influence and relative income. So if a husband earns more, this chart on the left shows that if the husband earns more, typically the husband it should say, instead of husband earns more, it's who makes the decision. That's the question on purchasing. So where if the wife earns more, the wife makes the decision 46% of the time. If the husband earns more, the husband makes the decision 35% of the time, the wife makes it 36% of the time. And so it's actually kind of fascinating, because any way you look at it, the wife is making more decisions on consumer behavior. Now, I know there's a lot of people say, no, that's not the way it is in my house. I know there's a lot of people say, oh, that's the way it is in my house. But I think that what these are statistics that we can go off of, and we as marketers don't have to pick a spot to fight. We could just know, like, hey, if the decision making is over 1/3 of the time having to deal with the female, maybe our ad or our marketing campaign should be aimed at what they need to make that decision. So that's just a little piece there that we could look at. This is free therapy if you're married, to go home and talk to your wife about this, but you can, or your husband, and you can sit there and say, okay, there are basically 6 approaches that individuals use to resolve purchase conflicts, and we're all guilty of this, whether it's with our spouse or our parent or our child. So the first one is bargaining. We try to reach a compromise. How many times have you bargained to, okay, I'll do this if you do that, or we'll go here tonight if we can go there tomorrow. Just this weekend in Moab, my wife and I went to an Italian food restaurant, and she wanted to go to the same place the next night. I'm like, please, I don't want to do Italian again. I'd like Mexican. Well, guess what? We ended up going to a barbecue place, and neither of us were happy, so I went and got some Mexican afterwards, and she went and got Italian, so the bargaining didn't work out, but that's all right. Impression management. So this is when we misrepresent the facts in order to win. Did you know that I can get a discount if I have this item? Or, like, you can make something up. So you misrepresent a fact in order to win an argument. The use of authority, claiming superior expertise and role appropriateness. Look, honey, I'm the one in the household that has bought every TV, so I should be the one buying this TV. Anytime we use a claim to authority, I just say is one of those fallacies of logic. And, you can't just win the argument by claiming authority. Otherwise, I'd win all the time. Just kidding. Reasoning, using logical argument to win. And how many times have you walked someone down a path of, do you think this is a good idea? I think this is a good purchase, but I'm doing it because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And at the end of that, they're going to be like, oh yeah, of course, because they just walked down your logical path. So, using logic to do that. Or playing on emotion. This could be negative manipulation, where you're like, well, if you're not going to do it, I'm not talking to you. Or we're not having this discussion anymore. To, well, if you do, I will be so happy that I'll be willing to, take you to the movies or something. I don't know, you can use on emotion. Are you sure you're not the best wife? I mean, I've always thought you're the best wife, and my best version of a wife would always let me buy this. These are the kinds of manipulations I would say that we use in these conflict resolutions. And finally, getting additional data or a third-party opinion. Have you ever said, you know what, forget it. We're gonna ask somebody, and whatever they think, we're gonna go with. I think back to the Office episode where Michael Scott is trying to figure out how to spend the extra money in their budget, and one half of the office wants a copier, and the other half of the office wants new chairs, and so they bring up the third party, Hank from downstairs, the security guy. And he gets to make the decision, and no matter what, that's going to be final because there's too much of an argument having here. So that's a funny way of having that third-party opinion. So, using this, let's throw it into a strategy. And so, based on how decisions are made, we can go through and ask ourselves, okay, what stage in the decision process are we at right now with our product? And who's involved? So you can just go through and use this to say, okay, who's involved with problem recognition? Why are they looking at this? And then what's something that we can address to talk about it? Then information search. We can go down through all of these and say, who are we talking to in the family? So we can first say, which household life cycle are they in? Who's going to be the buyer and who's going to be the user? And then we can go through and say, okay, now which part of the process of decision making are we in right now? So that was wrapping that part up, and I want to just briefly jump into socialization and then a little bit about kids. So consumer socialization is the process by which young people acquire skills, knowledge, and attitudes relevant to their functioning as consumers in the marketplace. So believe it or not, you learned from your parents and from experience, or whoever raised you, and then what you've gone through in your life, what your attitude is towards purchasing. Could even be your peers. So we just want to understand what this is and how does it work on consumption. So stage 1 of cognitive development here, according to Piaget's stages, is the period of sensory motor intelligence. Sorry. And that's 0 to 2. Now, you don't know what's going on before you're 2. You're just living, and you're not thinking. You're just kind of growing up at that point. Your brain's forming. You're trying to learn how to talk and walk. I mean, you're getting some basic things down, but you're also absorbing what's going on around you. So when you hit stage 2, 3 to 7, ages 3 to 7, this is when the way you talk, the way people refer to things, I mean, all of that starts really becoming part of you and your psyche, which then moves into stage 3, which is where from 8 to 11, typically a child develops the ability to apply logical thought to concrete problems. So they can actually start making decisions based upon a framework that they've been given up to that point in their life. If you have a hot stove and kid touches it, you know, they're going to learn really quick through that physical pain that they do not touch a hot stove. Now, let's just say you're a great parent and you prevented your kid from ever touching a hot stove. Well, how do they know not to touch the hot stove? It's probably through reinforcement and you telling them what happened. So when they come in and you're not around, they're like, okay, should I touch the hot stove or not? The logical thought is, no, I'm not going to do that because mom or dad told me it was hot. And then finally, period of formed operation. So this is when that a child has reached their peak and they can start making decisions. Now, I would actually say, this is not part of the course, but your frontal lobe isn't fully developed until you're 26. So it's really hard to understand the long-term consequences of your actions until that point. So there's more growth and development that happens even in your brain up to this point. But at this point, people start, making purchases. Just as a side tangent, this is why a lot of parents give their kids an allowance, or some people prefer to, say, hey, you get a stipend if you do chores or whatever, is to teach them good skills right from the beginning. That way that they are not having to struggle with that throughout their lives. So consumer socialization has 3 different categories, I would say. So we have skills, those things that you need to know in order to purchase, to understand money, to do budgeting. I love my 2 oldest children are just opposites, and I think it's because I figured out that I hadn't done enough with my oldest child. I love him to death, but he just wouldn't save money, didn't really keep a bank account, didn't want to get a job, all these things. And he's not bad, it just wasn't wired into him. Well, my daughter, my second child, she got a job, has a big savings and a bank account, feels like she's got enough to go to college. She's just kind of been a little bit more intelligent with her money. But I also got her in a financial literacy class that my son didn't get into. So I don't think I could take credit for that, but I could get her the skills for that because she was able to see that in action. We've had a lot more money conversations than my son and I have. Then consumption-related preferences. So I would hope at this point, none of my children will buy anything but an Apple iPhone. And that's probably because they've seen that and that's what I provided for them. And so that's just, some knowledge about what to look for, how to buy a car. I'm still waiting. My son bought a car. I helped him do that. My daughter hasn't yet, and I'm trying to figure out how to help her learn the best way to go out and identify what she needs and how much she needs it for. She still wants it just to be cute, and that's not going to fly because that doesn't qualify as why you should be buying a car for me. So we haven't gotten quite there yet. And then finally, consumption-related attitudes, which is when they go out and do stuff, are they reacting? My daughter came to me one time and said, I want to buy a new iPad mini, because I had gotten her an iPad mini for Christmas a few years before. And she really wanted the pencil. She was learning how to draw. It's pretty much her laptop, so she does all of her homework on her iPad and her iPhone. And she came in and said, I saw this ad, and I think I really want the pencil on my iPad mini, and so I'd like to pay for it. Great, it's your money, let's do it. And she kind of walked me through what her thought was and what she wanted to do with it. And I've seen that be a really good purchase for her based upon, her logical thought of what she wanted to do. So moving on to the process of consumer socialization. I think that this instrumental training part, where a parent tries or attempts to bring about a certain response, this can be positive and negative. As an educator, if you and I were in class right now, I love being in the classroom because people never know if I like or dislike anything. And I think it's funny because I'll start questioning people on their purchases, and they start getting a little nervous and worried that they're making the wrong choice. I'm like, I'm not telling you you're making the wrong choice. I'm just asking you a bunch of questions. I like to remain pretty neutral, but that's very hard for a lot of people to do. I think it's good to just see how people are thinking and then allow them to develop better logic. I know I'm bad at that too, though, as a parent, because we all have our preferences, and that's just the case. And so, like, I've probably said enough times that I think Android is a horrible operating system, that my kids are never going to go to that. But it doesn't mean that, like, my son, when he went up to school, I asked him if he wanted a PC or a Mac. And he's like, I want a Mac, Dad. And I was like, okay, but hold on. Like, I think you're saying that because of my view of technology. And I want you to know, like, I love you no matter what tech you're going to want to buy. But I think that there's just some of that basic training. And they learned that from the modeling that I was giving them. The modeling of how I went about buying my electronics. The things that I look for when I'm purchasing, or how I go shop for food, let's just say. And then finally is the mediation, which is when a parent alters a child's initial interpretation of or response to a marketing or other stimuli. And I would say, like, sometimes children are told that, I'll tell you a great example here. This is kind of consumer behavior, but not. But like Facebook. Someone wants to get on Facebook and do social media. I have some very strong opinions about it because I'm a marketer and I know what Facebook is. It's not free. It's essentially daily signing up for like a rewards program where they give you something, but you have to give them your information. So it's a daily interaction of that. And I don't do that with anywhere. Like, I can go over to Costa Vida and they'll be like, oh, you'll get a free nacho if you give us your phone number and you activate notifications on your phone. And it's like, no, I'm not doing that, because I know what I would do with that information if I was a marketer. Just this weekend, I was at a Hyatt in Moab, and they said, hey, you'll get free breakfast if you just sign up for our club. I'm like, thank you, no, I don't want to give you my phone number. I have a burner email I can use if I ever have to for things. But it's like, yeah, like I just know too much, I would say, behind the scenes to want to give up that information, but my kids don't. And so I had to sit down with my son when he got back from his mission, and he got a new phone, and I was trying to explain to him, like, hey, if you activate notifications, that is my opinion, just my opinion, that is giving up your free will to look at the things you want. Instead, you're going to get hit with a dopamine response that someone wants to trigger in your brain saying, hey, come pay attention to me. I said, so you can do it if you don't want to, but I'm just letting you know, like, you're going to be creating patterns in your mind if you allow notifications on every app that comes on your phone that are going to be a dopamine hit. And so they're trying to train you to come back to the app all the time and use it. So if you want to do it, that's fine. If you don't want to do it, then just be aware what is happening. Okay? And so I was mediating at that point. I'm in this mediation phase. And, you know, my son's 20, but it's what happens when we market to children. And children are a large and growing market. They're not typically the ones that can buy the stuff, but they are the instigators or the initiators of getting a buyer to go do something. They'll probably be the user of the product at the end of the day. This is a great conversation we had a couple weeks ago in class about Juul, the vaping company. Now, a lot of people would say that Juul, it started off marketing bubblegum flavor and pina colada flavor, all these things that would typically be aimed at children. Is that ethical? Are they allowed to do that? Well, people were saying, no, you can't do this advertisement. And Jules like, but hold on, like, children aren't the only people that want a bubblegum flavor. There's other people that want it. This is part of the difficulty of making a decision on how far or not you go. Now, I would argue that Juul isn't trying to nefariously go after children, and I might be naive with that, but they are showing, like, you know, here's an alternative to smoking. Whether or not vaping is better or worse, and we don't need to have that conversation. I'm just saying, like, it is a thing that happens often. And, which cereal do you buy? Well, the kids aren't asking it for Lucky Charms because they just were meandering down the aisle at a Macy's and they were like, oh, Lucky Charms, that looks great. They're asking for Lucky Charms because they saw an ad and they're responding to a stimuli about that. Stimulus. So that's chapter 6. I hope you've enjoyed this. I can't wait to see what else you've got coming on. I love consumer behavior, and I just love the topics that we've been covering so far. And I'm so excited to go into the internal parts of ourselves after we've been doing so much stuff on the external. And I will see you soon. Bye-bye.